In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Good evening. Welcome. My name is Tracy Metz, and I'm the director of the John Adams Institute. And of course, a very special word of welcome to our speakers of this evening, Samantha Power and Karel van Oosterom. We have their books here. And I'd like to mention the fact that Karel van Oosterom's book, which originally appeared in Dutch, has also just appeared in English at Barnes & Noble. Congratulations, Karel. Our mission at the John Adams is to bring the best and the brightest of American thinking to the Netherlands. For the past 33 years, that has meant that our speakers were actually here, in person. Those were the days. Like so many other cultural institutions, we have pivoted to online events with guests such as Roger Ross Williams, Esther Safran Foer, Francis Fukuyama in collaboration with De Bali, and Madeleine Albright. All of the videos of those online events can also be watched on our website. Most of those events, like tonight's, have been free of charge. But of course, producing them is not really free. We want to ask you to consider making a donation to support the John Adams in these difficult times. The link is here in the chat and also on our website. This is our last event before the summer season, and we are going out with a bang. Today, indeed, we're welcoming Samantha Power, whom we all know as Obama's ambassador to the UN, and Karel van Oosterom, the permanent representative to the UN for the Netherlands. They have both written books about their work, which have both been published by our partner in this event, the Dutch publishing house Atlas Contact. And we'll be having a conversation with them. I will be here receiving and fielding your questions. And now I would like to give the floor to our moderator this evening, Chris Keine. Chris.
Thank you, Tracy, and good evening, and thank you very much for joining us on this steaming hot evening. But it's probably better inside than out at the moment. You did make the right choice, as Tracy mentioned, because I'm also delighted with our guests tonight. And with the topic that we'll be discussing, broadly defined in my own terms, how to strike a balance between idealism and realism, or maybe better said, how to combine the two in the realm of the United Nations. Because, as Tracy said, we have two ambassadors to the United Nations with us tonight. Samantha Power, who held the position from August 2013 till the end of President Obama's term in January 2017. And Karel van Oosterom, who is the permanent representative to the UN since 2013 also, but is still in function there. They both wrote books, as Tracy said, about their experience. Samantha Power's book is called The Education of an Idealist. It's her third major piece of writing after A Problem from Hell, which was her Pulitzer awarded study on genocide, and Chasing the Flame on this UN giant, Sergio Vieira de Mello. And as far as I know, The Orange Tie, the book by Karel van Oosterom, is his first book, and where Samantha Power's book is about her whole werdegang as an idealist, also outside the UN. Karel van Oosterom's book is focusing on the year that the Netherlands was part of the member of the Security Council as one of the 10 elected members, and for one month presiding over the Security Council. So that was, of course, after Ambassador Power's tenure, but they've worked together for many years. So I'm sure we have a lot of common ground to cover tonight. So I would like to welcome you very much, Ambassador Powers, to start with you. I cannot hear you. I'm sorry.
How is it possible that after so many Zooms, I make the same mistake? I just want to say it's a special pleasure to celebrate Karel's book and its publication. It reads like a novel, Karel. It reads like a novel.
And I just realized that I make the mistake that infuriates you because I said Powers. And of course, you're called Power, and everybody always says Powers. Samantha Power, welcome very much. From where are you speaking to us?
From Massachusetts, the home of the American Revolution.
Okay. And is it a relief to not be the ambassador to the United Nations in these times, or are you itching to get back in a position like that?
I think nothing about the Trump presidency is a relief, and the Trump presidency coincides, of course, with all of us Obama people not only not serving in the government, but also being excommunicated, as any Trump official who has contact with an Obama official inherently draws suspicion from the president. It's a very kind of zero-sum Manichaean worldview. And but when you see, the U.S. leading the world in corona deaths, and you see the climate denial, and you see so many conflicts around the world where the U.S. is not really playing any kind of role, never mind a catalytic role, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for Americans who are paying the price, and it's heartbreaking for people around the world. So I can say that Karel can't, and probably wouldn't, but so in that sense, I think we're all eager to begin to dig out of the hole that Trump has left the United States, the American people, the world.
Yeah, we'll come to speak about that. Karel van Oosterom, a very warm welcome to you too.
Thank you very much.
And from where are you speaking to us?
I'm speaking from my home, which is very close to the end, but in New York we're still in a sort of lockdown, which is really in a worse state than we are in Holland. In the Netherlands we really have already started opening up. Here, certainly at the UN, all work now is virtual. And I've been once to the United Nations last week, or twice I should say, to cast a vote in the Security Council election. It was wonderful to see my colleagues again, but for the rest, my life is like Zoom, and I feel like part of the Zoomers generation.
And as for your home, is it anything like the suite in the Waldorf Astoria that Ambassador Power describes, where she was doing long distance running with her kids in the corridors?
No, it's much smaller and the ceilings are much lower. So.
Okay. I don't think it's exaggerating. Ambassador Power hinted at it to say that these are interesting times, especially also for the UN and the relationship the UN has with the United States. Does that give you energy, or are you longing for something quiet after 7 years at this position?
I'm sorry.
No, that was for Karel, yes.
If it's 7 years, it must be me, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah.
Who asked the question to us?
Yeah, that's for you, Karel.
Most important for us is to pursue our own agenda and to try to achieve what we want to achieve. And certainly when we were in the Security Council, we had a number of key priorities: improving peacekeeping operations, accountability and prevention of conflict. And there we built coalitions with our friends in the Council, with our allies in the Council, and we try to make a difference. And I wrote the book to try to show on the one hand to the Dutch people why the Dutch taxpayer pays my salary, and the other, and that's why I translated it in Dutch, to share with my colleagues and certainly with the elected members in the Council practicalities and how the reality of the Council is, how personal relations can help you achieve your results as well.
Yeah, that's one of the things we will definitely talk about, how important personal relations are and how you establish them. You've both been so kind as to send us some pictures and some clips about your work in the United Nations. So I will try to have the conversation guided by these pictures and clips. And please excuse my outfit, because it's steaming hot in this studio too. And Karel, I felt that I could do this because you broke one rule when the Dutch were presiding over the Security Council. You took off your jacket there.
That's true. There's some very funny rules, especially in the confidential consultation room, which Samantha knows very well, that some permanent members felt very strictly that you always had to wear a jacket. It was not allowed to eat a sandwich and not have a coffee. And I thought, well, taking off my jacket is what I do everywhere. So at a certain moment when the Russian colleague had opened up the meeting in their presidency, when everyone had worn a football shirt, and he came into the meeting with a football shirt. The president was there, and with my British and Polish colleague, we took off our jackets. So as of that moment, when it was very hot, I could just be in my shirt.
Okay, well, that's why I took off my jacket too. It's very hot in here. Samantha, I know that Karel van Oosterom would like to be addressed as Karel. Can I take the liberty to go to Samantha?
Of course, please.
Okay, I will do that. Can we have the first picture? That would be number 1. When was this taken, Samantha? Do you see it?
Yeah, I think since I left government, but I think maybe in New York by a Dutch photographer, perhaps.
Okay.
I recognize my Apple Watch, which I only acquired in order to get back into shape after I left the 8 years of the Obama administration. So it's post-government, that's all I know.
Oh, it's post-government, because I was wondering, and probably it's as trivial as that the photographer asked you to look at a horizon, but what were you thinking at the time? Were you thinking, where did it go wrong in my life, or however was I allowed to do that job?
I was probably thinking, who the hell is going to pick up my kids at school? Why doesn't Cass do the dishes? No, I'm post-government, so I'm in a period there where I'm both. I've thought about this a lot, but as a parent, my children now are 11 and 8. Which Karel probably can't believe because he knew them when they were running around the ambassador's residence as tiny children. But when you're a parent, you want the clock to go much slower. You want to freeze your children's milestones in time. You don't want it to pass too quickly. But when you live under Trump's presidency, you want the clock to move very, very quickly. And so probably in my gaze lies some contemplation of this contradiction.
Yeah, okay. I'm not going to ask you how on earth did you combine raising your kids with being the ambassador to the United Nations, because that's such a sexist question. It is very clear from your book that you're a very involved person, that you're very involved with the world. And there's a lot to be said about it, which unfortunately we will not be able to do tonight because of time. But am I very wrong that one of the most formative experiences for you, which made you so engaged with human rights issues, broadly spoken, was your time as a journalist in Bosnia during the war in Yugoslavia?
Yes, and I would even, given that we have a wonderful Dutch audience, maybe even add a beat to that, which is very specifically the events of July 1995, from 25 years ago in Srebrenica. Mm-hmm. But I'm an Irish immigrant to America. My mother, there was no divorce in Ireland back in the day. My mother and my father were splitting up. My father was a big drinker, and she moved me and my younger brother to Pittsburgh. Grew up there. My way of fitting in America was sport, and more sport. As Karel knows, he organized football games among the UN ambassadors, and I think some of the more sexist permanent representatives were a little surprised to see me donning my cleats and my shin guards, but I've always been very sporty, and I grew up wanting to be a sportscaster. That was my currency in America, my way of getting American friends. I dropped my accent, I memorized statistics and baseball history. But when I was in college, I had an experience where I was working at a TV station taking notes on a baseball game in order to help cut the highlights in the news, and I saw the footage from Tiananmen Square in June of 1989 on the feed right next to where I was watching the ball game, and that kind of set me on a path where I wanted to do something in international affairs. I wouldn't have said human rights per se. But right when I graduated from college, it was after the wall had fallen, in November '89, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, at a time of such amazing promise where Fukuyama was predicting the end of history and the triumph of liberal democracy, a very, very different vibe than college graduates are experiencing right now, whether in the Netherlands or here in the United States. And the blemish on that, or the kind of bizarre sort of seeming anachronism amid all that good news, was the war that was raging in Southeastern Europe. And it was, people kind of wanted to swat it away initially, and it wasn't part of the meme, it wasn't part of where history was supposed to be going. Little did we know then that it was a preview of some of the dynamics that we would see today, a quarter century later. But because I've been a sports reporter, and I was very moved by what was happening as people were targeted just because of their ethnicity or their religion, women rounded up in rape camps and so forth, I went over there as a freelancer and was there for 2.5 years. And just by being so young, I think in part, but also witnessing the UN in action or not, humanitarian aid, which dealt with symptoms, but of course couldn't get at the root causes of the conflict, the difficulties in US-Russian relations. I mean, in some ways it was, a kind of preview of many of the dynamics that Karel and I would work on together and in parallel in New York, but it was very, very formative. Yeah. And in July 1995, when the Serbs were moving toward the town of Srebrenica, and of course so many civilians were gathered at the Dutch base, I was a rookie reporter trying to get my editor to listen to me and to believe that this was going to be a very, very significant news story and a very severe tragedy. And the response I got from my editor was, well, it sounds like when Srebrenica falls, then we'll have a story. That's when the story will be. And that became a kind of defining moment, I think, for me, where I thought, journalism, you're always at the mercy of the gatekeepers. For one massacre to stand out compared to another, for your average reader, by then in the war, people had experienced some compassion fatigue. So I think with that experience, it really moved me to try to pivot from journalism. I would always write. I love writing. It's the way I make sense of things in the world. But it was a foundational moment of, gosh, maybe one day I can find myself in a position where I'm reading somebody's reportage from a place like this or a circumstance like this, and where I don't feel quite so impotent as I felt I think it was July 9th, 1995.
Yeah. So in that sense, you could say that there is a kind of straight line from Srebrenica to New York to the UN.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Karel, how is that for you? You've been on different posts. You've been part of the Dutch Foreign Service since the end of the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, beginning of the 90s. You've been based in Beijing. You've been based in Canada. You've been based in Damascus in Syria. Is there any moment where you thought, now I'm experiencing history, and now I know why I'm doing this?
There's a number of issues which connect to this. First, Samantha and I, we worked very closely on promotional human rights for LGBTI people. We really had a very strong alliance, and the Netherlands is co-chair of the core group to promote those rights at the UN, and that we really make a difference. And I vividly remember when I was in the army in 82, 84, the captain, my boss, he was a very macho type. When he came to my marriage 2 years later, when I married Anna, then he confessed the day after that he was gay and that he had to keep that a secret for all of his life. And then a couple of years later, he died of AIDS, and that is a very strong personal motivation for me to continue fighting for LGBTI rights. So that was one formative experience. Second was when I started in Damascus in 92. I visited Beirut almost every week, and then the war had just stopped. And I could not have expected that Syria now, after 7, 8 years, 9 years almost, 9 years it is, of war, now looks like Beirut like it did in 92. And to see the consequences of war made me realize that we have to do what we can, and that's also what we try to do in the Security Council, to prevent conflict, to make sure that people who are suffering from conflict the most, women, girls, children, we have to do our best to prevent that. And then the last point on Srebrenica, I think there's a historic responsibility for the Netherlands, and it's one of the background elements why we did so much to improve peacekeeping operations, because we know what can go wrong if it goes wrong. So we have to make sure that peacekeepings are up to the task, peacekeeping missions, and that they're fit for purpose, and that there was a lot of our fight in the Security Council about.
Yeah. Can we have picture number 2? You are somewhere there, Karel. Is this what you pictured as you were growing up as a kid that you would be doing later?
Now, first, maybe I have to explain what we saw in the picture. That's a visit of the Security Council to Afghanistan, to President Ghani, where we met with the full session of the Security Council with the Afghan government, and we did a number of things there. We gave a very clear political signal that we would support political negotiations with the Taliban on the one hand. Second, that we would continue to fight terrorism. And thirdly, promotion of women's rights in Afghanistan. My dream as a kid, I wanted to be a football player, and I stuck with it. So the story of my life is that Marco van Basten, my hero, who was very close born to where I was born, he was playing in the first team of my amateur football team when I was 16, and I was in the 13th team, and that's about the level of difference in our competence, in our skills.
Okay, so that's where it went wrong in your life. I wanted to show that picture because there's a feeling I got from your book, Samantha, and maybe we can see the next picture. Yeah, this is you with the president, of course. There's a feeling I got from your book that one of the difficult shifts you had to make, being an idealist, as you mentioned yourself, the education of an idealist, was that when you entered first the Obama government in another position and later the UN, you entered a bureaucracy, which is something you didn't know. Is that indeed one of the big cultural shocks you had to deal with as an idealist?
I wouldn't put it probably that way. Weirdly, the pushing of paper, the kinds of the things that people think about bureaucracy from the outside that I would have thought didn't really bother me. It was almost like moving to America at a young age and learning those baseball statistics, I think, if I can use that analogy, and just trying to figure out what the lingua franca was, having the same objective inside the government that I had had as an activist outside, namely to try to push a human rights and humanitarian agenda, to try to get the president and in my first 4 years, the various cabinet ministers to take seriously the human consequences of US decision-making in the same way they would think through the economic consequences or the security consequences for the US. So in a way, I felt like I was taking my agenda, and then I had to go in, I had to learn the rules and how it worked. The one exception I would offer, where there really was a culture shock, were the gender dynamics within a bureaucracy. I had never worked in a large organization. I'd worked solo as a reporter and as a professor and as an activist. And so suddenly, I'm making arguments in meetings, and they're kind of falling flat, landing like lead balloons in the Situation Room. And, I'm thinking to myself, is this because I'm a former journalist and activist and I'm just not very good at this yet? Is it because I'm the president's human rights advisor and there's a lot of gravity cutting against human rights policy within the American national security establishment, and so I'm the skunk at the lawn party? Or is it because I'm female and this is a kind of clubby atmosphere that is overwhelmingly male, white and male, I should say. And initially I thought it was me, but as I got to know other women who were part of the same bureaucracy and dealing with so many of the same issues, but who worked on really hardcore security issues like non-proliferation, or who were advising the president on the transatlantic relationship, they were having just the same issues I was. And so we began to realize that there was a gender dynamic at work. And that was, I know it's kind of pathetic that it took working in a large organization to be really living that for the first time. I mean, I was aware that others had lived it and were living it, but it taught me some survival techniques that I then tried to carry with me to the UN. Not so much for me, because at the UN I was America and the host country and a very powerful country, but really for other female ambassadors who comprise the membership of the UN, or female UN employees. Because if I thought Washington was male, and those unconscious biases or some of that dismissiveness was at work, the UN was that in spades for my female colleagues.
I did show the picture of you and President Obama, because another thing that I noticed from your book is that all of a sudden, while you were relatively close with Barack Obama, all of a sudden it was very hard to reach him. And it caused the fact that whenever you met him and he wanted to chat about the children, you attacked him with important points to discuss, and you felt that he got annoyed by that. That must have been a strange dynamic to get used to.
That's a great point. Actually, I probably should have mentioned that in my first response. Yes, the shriveling up of access to the president. That was also a bit of a reality check when I got to the White House. I worked with Senator Obama since his early days in the U.S. Senate. He pretty much set me up with my husband, Cass. We were friends, as well as, he was someone, of course, that I'd invested a lot in supporting. I'd been with him on the campaign. And then suddenly here he is, Mr. Big, and he gives his personal email address, the people around him, and this is true of every president, but the gatekeepers are making judgments about who's in and who's out on the basis also of what they want the president to hear. And some of what I wanted to say may not have been seen to rise to the level of the president, given that we were dealing with such a severe economic recession and he was juggling an awful lot. But sometimes if they didn't like what I had to say and the issue was on the table, that might be another reason that I might not have made it into the meeting. So that was an adjustment. And I wallowed a little bit, as I write in the book. I was a bit self-pitying at the outset. My husband and I would leave every night, and we had this two-dimensional axis or graph kind of in our minds that we developed, which was two axes. One was effective and the other was respected. And so we'd say, because my husband was in charge of regulation for Obama, and so we'd leave every night, walk by the White House, see the amazing facade lit up, and feel the privilege of the experience we were having and working for this extraordinary leader in Barack Obama. But I'd say, how was it? And Cass would say, effective, not respected. And I'd say, not respected, not effective. And it varied, you could get a lucky break one day. But actually, Richard Holbrooke, who Karel knows, the late great American diplomat, was one of the people who just got very impatient with my focus on whether I was meeting with the president. He said, those meetings that you want to be in, there'll be 10 of those before a decision is made. There are so many issues that you can work on in the U.S. government by bringing like-minded people together, by hustling, by driving your list of priorities. And if it's not about access, it's about impact. And so when I think of the education of an idealist, it's less about, I started so idealistic and then I realized it's also very hard. I didn't have that experience of government or of working at the UN, but I did have the experience of learning how to get more effective in prosecuting the ideals that I brought into government. And part of that learning also, of course, comes out of being ineffective. I mean, it's not as if I was, believe me, only effective, but it's just about learning how to build those coalitions, how to learn from your mistakes, and just being savvier about the system.
Yeah. We have a question from Tom, and his question relates exactly to this, and I think this would be a good moment also to show the video that Samantha sent us. He asked about how do we manage to deal with the contradictions of, on the one hand, having that power and being so limited in what you could do with it. And he mentioned in this case specifically Syria. Yeah. So I thought this might be
I'd like to do it a little bit different. I'd like to start with the video of Karel, if you don't mind, because we're going to discuss Syria quite extensively, and especially the relationship with the Russian ambassador in that respect. So we'll come to that question then, if you don't mind. So could we show the clip of Karel van Oosterom, please, the book, such that we know. Karel, did you pick the music?
Actually, I did not, but I could have. But for me, it's a little bit light. I prefer more punk and new wave.
Okay. You mentioned in the book, and it's clear from the clip, that the 3 focus points of the Dutch in their year in the Security Council were peace, justice, and development. Could you elaborate a little bit on why this focus?
I loved what Samantha was saying on also the bureaucracy. You have to pick your fights. You have to really make clear priorities. If you're in the Security Council, the agenda is horrific. It's like 76 total agenda items. And if you don't play it clever, then you're just eaten up by the agenda. So from the beginning, we said we have to focus on things we think are important. Like I mentioned, peacekeeping, where we have a historic responsibility. Second, prevention of conflict. And thirdly, I think also very important for the Netherlands, we are host to the International Criminal Court, to the International Court of Justice. Accountability for us is a key issue. We could not have dreamt in 95, after the 11th of July, that we should see Milosevic and Karadzic and Mladic in a prison in The Hague. So accountability for mass atrocities is something which is close to our heart, but it's also key that leaders in the world who are about to commit mass atrocities know that there may be a moment they will be brought to court. So it has a very strong preventive effect as well. Mm-hmm. So we focus on that a lot, and one of the things which connects Samantha and me, about 10 years ago, I remember when I visited you in the White House, and we began working on prevention of mass atrocities, and the whole genocide prevention agenda, where I think we made a difference. So we have to make clear priorities, fight for what we believe in, and build effective coalition, and that's what diplomacy is about.
Okay. Well, now that you mention mass atrocities, maybe this is a good moment to show the clip that Samantha Power sent us.
Regime, Russia and Iran, your forces and proxies are carrying out these crimes. Your barrel bombs and mortars and airstrikes have allowed the militia in Aleppo to encircle tens of thousands of civilians in your ever-tightening noose. It is your noose. 3 member states of the UN contributing to a noose around civilians. It should shame you. Instead, by all appearances, it is emboldening you. You are plotting your next assault. Are you truly incapable of shame? Is there literally nothing that can shame you? Is there no act of barbarism against civilians, no execution of a child that gets under your skin, that just creeps you out a little bit? Is there nothing you will not lie about or justify?
Samantha Power, this was at the end, I think, more or less of your tenure, or towards the end, which of course started in 2013. You just arrived as a UN ambassador with the chemical attacks of the Assad regime on the outskirts of Damascus and Ghouta, where 1,400 civilians were killed, and among them 400 children. What did we see here? Was this a buildup of 7 years of anger? What did we see here?
The short answer is yes, I think. I think that the Syrian revolution began in 2011. This was, as you noted, late 2016. It's also important to bear in mind that the US election of November 2016 had occurred. I think the reason, by the way, that's not my video, that came from USA Today, it looks like, at least from the Chiron. And the reason that mainstream American publications were interested in that exchange at that time, I think, was, I wish it were just merely regard for what was happening to people in Aleppo and Syria, but it was also because of Russian interference in the US election. And it was also because we had just elected a president, nudged along perhaps by some of that interference, but we just elected a president who was incapable of shame, it seemed, and who was fond of lying and propagating misinformation. So I think its viral scope stemmed something from the fact that it was a kind of cry from the heart about more than the topic in the Security Council of that day, of that moment. In terms of me, I think very much it grew out of this larger context. I also should note that when I sat in the chair that day to attend that emergency meeting of the Security Council because of the shellacking of Aleppo occurring, I came from a meeting with President Obama, a National Security Council meeting, so from NSC to a UNSC. And what was so striking, and it was the first time I really had this experience of the difference in working for a president after an election has occurred in which another president has been chosen. Now, if Hillary Clinton had been chosen, there wouldn't have been that feeling. It would have been a more seamless transition. But it was very clear that whatever we did in terms of sanction, in terms of condemnation about what the Syrian government and Russia and Iran were doing to civilians, it was clear to us that Donald Trump would undo all of that as soon as he came into office. I mean, that was the message that Trump himself had sent. And so I think when you say, was it letting loose? It was, but the fact that it went viral gave me it was no solace. We were America, and yet we were confronting the limits of our ability to influence monstrous behavior. So it was heartbreaking. And so I didn't stay and relish the showdown with the Russian ambassador. I went back to my office just as sad as I remember being.
Yeah, but on your scale of effectiveness, because in the book it's very clear that you've both stressed the importance of personal relations, and you make very clear that you've always tried to keep cordial relations with Vitaly Churkin, who was the ambassador to the UN from Russia. While in his book, Karel van Oosterom mentions in the end that in the end of your tenure, you hardly spoke to each other. Is that a defeat then? Is that something that you think failed? I mean, not especially you that failed, but the whole endeavor?
If the whole endeavor is U.S.-Russia ties, they deteriorated massively while Carol and I worked there together. And again, no fault of ours, but what was happening in Moscow, Putin's own hardening, his invasion of Ukraine, the shoot down of the MH17 and the massive loss of life and the failure to own up to that accountability that was the Dutch and others pushed. And then what happened in Syria, and then the interference in elections, it made it very, very hard in New York to patch up a relationship that was being broken by, I think, principally the actions of President Putin. But I tried, and Vitaly Churkin, the Russian ambassador, I mean, we didn't try to patch it up, but we tried to extract as much water from that stone as we could. And I think, given where relations were between our two countries, we did actually a surprising amount. We created a joint investigative mechanism to look into Syrian chemical weapons use, which Moscow at the highest levels was very, very suspicious of. We, even though Russia doesn't like seeing human rights officers proliferating in UN peacekeeping missions around the world, I think in part because I worked so hard to maintain that relationship, partly maybe because Moscow didn't want that fight at that time, but we did succeed in expanding the civilian protection capabilities that Karel was alluding to earlier, beginning that process, bringing about accountability also for the peacekeepers themselves who were involved in committing human rights abuses or sexual violence. These kinds of things. Russia has the veto. They can toss that around as often as they want. And so I did view it as my responsibility as someone looking out for U.S. interests and believing that U.S. interests are linked to global stability and to peace and to human rights, to do what I could to get Russia to be very, very sparing in the use of its veto. Now, the area that it used its veto again and again and again, including in Karel's time on the council, was with regard to Syria. Even there, Vitaly and I worked on getting Syrian political prisoners out of jail and worked on a humanitarian resolution that got food to the northern part of Syria that had been cut off. It's a pittance. It's somebody would say, a snowflake on the Potomac. It's nothing compared to the carnage and the suffering of the Syrian people. But if I had just written off that relationship and given up on us being able to forge some common ground, I think I would have been far less effective.
Yeah. And Karel, how did you do that? How did you maintain relationships with the Russian ambassador after 193 of our countrymen were killed by a Russian rocket when MH17 was downed?
Well, first of all, by working together with friends like Samantha and other people at the council who were extremely supportive in July 2014. And have been ever since. And Resolution 2166 we owe in large measure to Samantha and her team. On the point Samantha just mentioned, for instance on Syria, it's gotten worse. The mechanism to investigate chemical weapons was killed off end of 2017 by the Russians with 3 successive vetoes. What we have to do at the end is if it doesn't go through the front door, let's try it through the back door. So what we did with a number of like-minded countries like the US and certainly European members, we went to the OPCW, and there we basically had to redo what Samantha did 2 years before, where we set up a similar mechanism because in the organization of the prohibition of chemical weapons, the Russians don't have a veto. So that's also, the problem in the Council is that if there's an issue at hand and on the agenda where one of the permanent members has a geopolitical interest, the veto blocks so much action, and then we have to go elsewhere. So we did it with chemical weapons, and we did the same with the mass atrocities in Syria, where we established the investigative mechanism to at least have all the proof of all the mass atrocities ready, which we then can use in subsequent legal proceedings, which is being used already in some places. And then my personal relationship with Vitaly at the time was extremely complicated because in 2015 we tried to set up a tribunal, and Samantha helped us a lot, and other members in the council as well, but Russia vetoed it. And I had a number of encounters with him where we really had to go head to head because to be effective in diplomacy does not mean to mince words. Sometimes you have to be very frank, very blunt, and just fight it out with words. And it was not always a pleasure, but we had to do it.
Yeah. In the meantime, we have a lot of questions from our viewers. So
some
Tracy,
of them particularly relevant to this point. Samantha asks, a person named Plerner asks, the UN Security Council Permanent 5 veto is now an anachronism after 75 years. We've just been talking about that. And there are many calls for reform. So how do we bring that about to keep the body legitimate in the post-COVID-19 era?
And the question is to?
To Samantha.
Okay, thank you. I'd be interested in Karel's views on this, but I think the path to the kind of reform that would do away with the veto is, at least at this moment in history, likely insurmountable, insofar as all 5 permanent members, that means including the United States, Russia, China, would have to approve either the renunciation of the veto or the bestowal of that veto on other countries, and the countries that are the leading contenders to become permanent members on the basis of size and geopolitical and geoeconomic influence are countries that are, for example, let's say India, Japan, countries that China would not be interested in seeing sit on the council, I'm quite sure, or at least giving veto to. The last and only Security Council reform that has occurred happened, I think, was it Karel, 1965, I think, where the non-permanent membership was expanded, and something like that, I think, certainly is something that could get done. I worry that what Karel talked about earlier, just the sheer volume of issues that are coming before the Security Council, and the amount of time that ambassadors are spending in that body, making statements and frankly making speeches instead of hustling and negotiating behind closed doors, whether one-on-one or in smaller groups. I do worry that the expansion in size, which would answer at least a little bit of the concern about it being anachronistic that the questioner mentioned, that you get more representativeness in such a scenario, but you might get even less effectiveness. I'm not sure that numbers are, certainly there'd be no correlation in my mind between more countries and more effectiveness, but to look at it, I think what
we're
you're
back
going
to
to
that
see,
axis of effectiveness and together with your husband.
Respected and effective. That's a very good. I hadn't thought of that before. Exactly. Just the last thing I think quickly is simply that I think you are going to see, just as I think Karel's really interesting response to the last question illustrated, you are going to see more and more getting done on what would appear to be traditional peace and security issues at other UN bodies. Or at the OPCW and places like that, or I think you're going to see in a world, certainly if Biden is leading the United States, much thicker connections, networks of democracies in much more informal settings.
That has to do with the question that Rosa asked. We're celebrating the 75th anniversary, the birthday of the UN Charter tomorrow. But is it conceivable, given the unfriendly climate for the UN in the US, that the UN might actually leave for a friendlier region?
Is that for me?
Yes.
Well, take it if you want.
Take it and run with it.
I mean, I suppose I can add that now to my list of reasons that we can't afford 4 more years of Donald Trump. I didn't need many more items on that list. But, I mean, if you saw the United States continuing to pull funding at critical moments, like ending its membership, suspending its membership in the WHO and pulling funds at the height of a global pandemic, it's conceivable that the patience of fellow member states would wear out. But the US is still, by and large, even under Trump, by far the largest financial contributor, underwriter of the UN. You could see it in the other direction, where Trump, who, according to John Bolton's book, has come very, very close to trying to pull the United States out of NATO. You could see him in a tantrum, doing something along the lines of what he did to the WHO for the UN at large. I will say that Secretary General Guterres and actually Senator Lindsey Graham have done. Lindsey Graham as a kind of channel to the White House have done a good job, maintaining a relationship between President Trump, the man, the person, and the Secretary General. There are personal ties there. The Secretary General has invested in those. I think that might explain why the UN writ large actually hasn't been nearly as frequent a target of Trump's tweet rants as other organizations like NATO. So I don't see it happening, but I suppose my view of that is also colored by my knowledge that Joe Biden is running a very strong campaign and that Trump is being held accountable currently, at least in the polls, for his horrific and lethal mishandling of the corona pandemic.
Okay.
One of the key arguments we have been using in our discussions with our American friends is, can it be in American interest that so much space which the US is now leaving behind in certain organizations at the UN is being taken over by China and Russia? It's certainly not the Dutch interest. We want the US very active in the UN. We need the US to be very active. But to see the competing value systems of countries like Russia and China getting more important within the UN system, ever more also officials from those and other countries, it's certainly not a Dutch interest, and deep down I don't think it's an American interest. And I hope that argument strikes home, that will help in that discussion.
Well,
and no, I don't see the UN leaving New York.
Speaking about those values and the current position of the United States on the International Court, justice was one of your spearheads in the year in the Security Council. 2 weeks ago, I think, Secretary Pompeo announced that members of the International Court in The Hague will be sanctioned by America when they start investigating American soldiers, for instance, for what they've been doing in Afghanistan.
And their families.
What's the Dutch position on that, Karel?
Let's first get back on the question. You began with accountability in the Security Council. There we worked very effectively together with most of the members in the Council, and in the end all of them, on a number of accountability issues, of which one the most important probably was that we got to sanction human traffickers from Libya, people who were responsible for horrible human rights violation in the north of Libya, who were getting very rich by engaging in human trafficking. And we reached very, very strong sanctions against them, travel sanctions and financial sanctions. And to the ICC, this is a discussion we're having with the American administration, and we try to convince them that that is not the way ahead on this last issue.
Yeah, and how does that discussion go out?
That'll play out in the coming period.
Okay, let's move to a little more joyful topic. Something you both, I think, put on the record as one of the achievements you had during your tenure in the UN, and also our Dutch year in the Security Council. Maybe we can go to the pictures in number 9. No, number 9, please.
Well, this one's nice.
This is also nice. Yeah, that was the one. There you go.
Oh, that was great.
Where are we, Samantha?
That was very special.
Please tell us where we are, Samantha.
I mean, I feel I should let Karel. The Netherlands was the driver of the creation of this really important UN institution called the LGBT Core Group. And the US was a late-breaking member, of course, because under the Bush administration it had not joined, but we joined under the Obama administration happily. And it was a venue to brainstorm for what we could do to promote LGBT rights so that the kind of persecution and violence that occurs against LGBTQ people around the world, that those individuals who are experiencing that terror, that they would be able to look to the UN and to the UN instruments and norms and have a tool in their system to say that no matter what national laws say, it's just not right. Here are my rights. And that was the work that we did as partners, and just so grateful to the Netherlands and to Karel specifically for driving so many initiatives. The picture that you showed is just after the devastating Orlando Pulse terrorist attack, where an ISIS loyalist shot up a gay nightclub. And we had the idea to have a core group meeting in the wake of that vicious attack, something immensely positive had happened in the days, just a day or two between the attack and that visit, which is for the first time in this then 70-year history of the UN, the Security Council, notwithstanding Russia's presence, Putin's presence effectively on that council, notwithstanding the fact that African countries on the council at that time had on their books back in Africa very homophobic laws, we were able to get a consensus statement through the Security Council condemning for the first time in UN history attacks on the basis of sexual orientation. And this was, again, it can seem like just small ball in New York or just a piece of paper, but what we heard from gay rights activists around the world and transgender activists, just the extent to which it made them feel joined and seen. And in the wake of that statement, we decided to gather the LGBT core group and think, what else could we do? In the wake of this consensus, we in the Obama administration there wasn't that much time left on the clock. So we decided to convene the core group unusually at Stonewall Inn. Stonewall Inn, where most LGBTQ people date and most other people date the origins of the gay rights movement in New York, where finally, having been harassed for years and years by New York police, gay people at Stonewall Inn rose up and basically pushed back. And that then unleashed a kind of outing and an outpouring that was the stirrings of what would become something that would ultimately, many, many years later, result in gay marriage. And then even just last week, finally, the Supreme Court banning discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation, or interpreting the Constitution or interpreting statutes such that it was banned. So at that meeting, I'm going to give Karel more credit here. So I chaired the meeting. It was completely surreal. The core group, one of its many wonderful features is that a country from the North or the West, this sort of Europe-US axis, can't join the core group unless they join along with a country from the South. And so the membership in this core group is much more diverse than a lot of kind of human rights caucuses at the Security Council. But to have all those Latin American ambassadors and the beginnings of Asia's presence in this group, and I gather Nepal has joined quite recently, which is an amazing achievement for this group to again broaden the community of people who are pushing this agenda. But for them to all be ordering their pints of beer, and then to it was a solemn day. We were delivering flowers and commemorating the senseless killing of these people on grounds of their sexual orientation. But it was a forward-looking day of what are we going to do next? And Karel had the idea. It was you, right?
It was
got the UN General Assembly coming up, all the heads of state coming to New York. Why don't we paint the entrance, the crosswalk into UN headquarters in rainbow colors? Why don't we? And so heads of state now, as they enter UN headquarters and gather as they do every year in September, that they will traverse this path to equality. And so that was one of several ideas that grew out of it. I think also that was when we redoubled our conviction that we were going to pursue an independent expert on LGBT rights within the UN system, which had never existed before. So that's someone who's going to measure the treatment of LGBTQ people around the world. And that position still exists in part because Europe and Latin America and the Netherlands have refused to allow those who would wish to be spoilers to succeed. But, it's really amid a lot of bleak news when it comes to human rights around the world. This is really one of those areas where I think it is worth looking at the progress, at least normatively, that has been made, and even looking at Africa and what the positions of legislatures and courts are very, very slowly shifting, but much more quickly than people would have anticipated even just 5 years ago.
Yeah, certainly. And it also connects to a more general point I'd like to make about the UN. What you see both in Samantha's book and my book is that we often talk about words in New York, but how does it translate to reality on the ground, and how can we have impact on the ground? And a good example I like to use is that we have had many LGBTI resolutions here in New York. There's been a lot of fighting here to get real good non-discriminatory human rights language on LGBTI issues. And I was so proud 1.5 years ago when Indian Supreme Court came out with a ruling of over 500 pages decriminalizing LGBTI behavior, and quoting extensively from UN resolutions so that UN language here in New York can have direct impact on the ground.
Okay.
And that is what a better world is all about.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm glad we can end our conversation on this hopeful note, but we're not going to stop yet because we have a lot of questions from
we only
our
have
viewers.
4 more minutes, so we'll
so
have
go
to
ahead.
stay with 2 questions. We have a lot of people joining us from the University of Leiden, a lot of young students who are interested in a career in international affairs, and several of them have asked us, what would your advice, both of you, and then very short, please, be to young people who aspire to follow in your footsteps to be, for example, future ambassadors to the UN?
Read both our books and become an intern at our mission at the next possibility that COVID allows us.
Great.
We've had a wonderful group of interns here every year, and some of them now have become diplomats, so I think that's the best advice. What's yours, Samantha?
I think, but just to add to why reading Karel's book, and I hope my book as well, would be worthwhile, is it does have these very concrete examples of how you make a difference. And the newspapers are filled with examples of how you don't. And I think I think young people are not getting enough exposure to success stories in international statecraft, and that's one reason that they're staying away.
Okay.
My advice would be, if you don't mind, know something about something. Know something about
That's
something.
always wise.
I think young people are spread very thin. They want to be experts, understandably, on climate change, on mass migration, on economic inequality, God knows, on racial injustice. And it's very hard for young people today, given the number of challenges coming at them, to choose. But if you go deep on one thing, you're likely to have multiple careers where you work on multiple issues anyway. The going deep will serve you no matter what you're working on later. So just really dig into something in a deep way rather than feeling like you have to fight every war at
Our
once.
2 final questions are both one-word answer questions, so that should let us finish just in time. Both of them are actually for you, Samantha. A one-word answer, who do you want to see nominated as Biden's vice president? One name.
No way am I answering that question.
Come on.
I'm gonna have to work with and support from afar, whoever.
Okay, well
whoever it is.
that brings us exactly to the last question, which is also a yes or no question. Samantha Power, Secretary of State in the next administration?
Samantha Power, dedicated 24/7 to getting Joe Biden elected. And that is the cause of every Democrat, every believer in human rights, every person who believes in racial justice. It's so not about any of us. It's about making America, America again.
And if I may conclude with one last question, because your book is about educating an idealist. So the question would be, idealism and realism, is that a contradiction or is it 2 sides of the same coin?
For me, it's very clear it's 2 sides of the same coin. An idealist without realistic perceptions doesn't have impact on the ground. It's having impact on the ground. And realist without ideals will just accept how it is, and that's not good at all. I would like to say one thing, and as I have the floor, I quote Samantha in the beginning of my book. It's a beautiful sentence of your book where it says, "The people we love are the foundation of all else." I know, Samantha, that Cass, Declan, and Rian are very important for you. I know that Anna and Gustav are very important for me. So the advice I also have to the young students, make sure that your private life is in order and you find the love of your life as early as possible.
And Samantha, on realism and idealism?
If you're not thrilled about what you see around you, if you don't think things are trending in the direction you want, it means you have a set of standards and aspirations that you're applying to the world. You're not happy with the world as it is. You want to make it better. You're an idealist. You have to be realistic about how to be effective in closing those gaps between your aspirations and the world that you want to seek and the world that we encounter now. So You got to be savvy. You got to pick yourself up when you fall down. You got to build coalitions. You got to find great allies. Like if you're an American, you got to find the Netherlands. The Netherlands, hopefully, you'll get an America back that sees the critical importance of alliances with our closest friends and those who share our values. So it's all about how to get there, and I think very much flip side of the same coin. You can't be airy-fairy and think that just wishing something or having good intentions is going to be enough to pave that path. It takes a lot.
So, closing remarks?
Thank you very much, both of you.
Yeah.
Give the floor for the closing remarks to Tracy.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much again to both our speakers. Thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. And please feel free to share the video of this talk, which will be on our website very soon. We hope that, as I mentioned, you will consider giving a donation to the John Adams to help us through these difficult times. And I hope you'll join us on September 24th for our next event, perhaps a live event, and if not, an online event with David Frum of The Atlantic. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.